Welcome to The Reluctant Skeptic, where a former evangelical apologist takes a look at various religious and ideological claims through the lens of critical thinking. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at two issues I have with the Shroud of Turin, which many people believe to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, allegedly bearing a miraculous imprint of his body created by the supernatural energies of his resurrection. While the Catholic Church rarely displays the shroud, there have been occasional opportunities for scientists to examine it and even procure samples for testing. The consensus among most researchers who have examined the shroud data is that it's a 14th-century relic, unusual to be sure, and created using methods we don't entirely understand, but not miraculous, and, for that matter, not even from the 1st century. Even so, debate over the shroud continues, and many Christians strenuously argue for its authenticity. Now, for most of us, the details of the various scientific studies of the shroud are easily lost in the weeds. Most of us, after all, are not experts in radiometric dating, material sciences, or imaging technologies. We're largely dependent upon the opinions of the experts, and even researchers with impeccable credentials sometimes disagree. For that reason, I'm taking another approach to the shroud controversy, one that is much more readily accessible to the general public, especially to those who have any knowledge whatsoever of the Christian Bible. I'm going to point out two reasons why I believe the shroud is almost certainly not authentic, and all I ask in return is that you maintain an open mind. First, in evaluating the shroud as a miraculous relic of the resurrection, it's essential that we understand what the Bible has to say about the resurrection and its immediate aftermath. The Gospels differ on how they present the resurrection, evidencing, in my opinion, and that of many others, including some Christian scholars, a phenomenon known as legendary development. The Gospels don't all tell the story the same way. The earliest, Mark, ends abruptly with no resurrection appearances at all. Later accounts in Matthew, Luke, and John steadily add more details, and more sensational details at that. Earthquakes, angels, physical demonstrations, illustrating for us that Christianity was evolving and the later gospel writers were trying to deal with the spread of oral traditions and apologetic challenges. One area where the Gospels do agree, however, even though they portray this differently, is in the narrative that Christ's disciples were slow to believe in his resurrection. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus doesn't even appear to anyone following his resurrection, although an appearance is foretold. See Mark 16. Matthew tells us that the 11 male disciples, Judas having died, were told by two of Jesus' female disciples to go to Galilee, where the text says that Jesus appeared to them, although it notes that some were doubtful. Luke's Gospel tells us that when the women went to the 11 disciples to tell them of Jesus' resurrection, these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe. Although Peter went to the tomb, where he found the discarded grave wrappings, and then went home, marveling at what had happened. Note here that the text does not explain why he marveled. Was it because he was convinced that Jesus had been raised, or did he wonder if perhaps someone had moved the body? Later, when Jesus physically appeared to his disciples, Luke says that they were frightened and thought they were looking at a spirit, and even when he showed them his wounds, they still could not believe because of their joy and astonishment, although afterward they fully embraced the reality of his resurrection. John's Gospel tells us that Mary Magdalene found the tomb empty and went to inform Peter and the mysterious disciple whom Jesus loved, who then went to the tomb to investigate, with the result that the disciple whom Jesus loved immediately believed. Nothing is said about Peter's response here. Mary herself then saw Jesus, although she didn't immediately recognize him, believing him rather to be the gardener. She then went and informed the disciples, and Jesus himself later appeared to them, Thomas being absent at the time, and the text tells us they rejoiced when they saw the Lord. When they told Thomas, however, he was unimpressed and didn't believe them until 8 days later when Jesus appeared again, this time with Thomas present. Lastly, in chapter 1 of the book of Acts, the author tells us that Jesus presented himself alive after his suffering by many convincing proofs, appearing to them, that is, his disciples, over a period of 40 days. Now, having completed that short survey of the Gospel accounts, let's break this information down for its relevance to the shroud controversy. First, we see that depending on which Gospel you read, the disciples were more or less slow to believe in the resurrection. Second, they ultimately believed due to a preponderance of several kinds of evidence: the empty tomb, the burial wrappings in the tomb, Christ's physical appearances to them, in which he showed them the wounds of his crucifixion and ate in their presence to demonstrate that he was not a ghost. Third, at no point in any of these accounts are we told that there is anything special about Jesus' burial wrappings beyond the simple fact that they are found empty. They were not, in and of themselves, sufficient to convince any of the disciples of the resurrection except for the disciple whom Jesus loved. This is mentioned only in the Gospel of John, and again the disciples' belief is prompted only by the fact that the wrappings are empty. Fourth, contrary to Luke and John, Matthew's Gospel tells us that some of the 11 disciples continued to doubt the resurrection right up until the day Jesus ascended into heaven. Fifth, we are never told, either in any of these accounts or anywhere else in the New Testament, that the disciples either kept or exhibited Jesus' burial wrappings. In fact, as far as we can tell from the text, only the women, Peter, and the disciple whom Jesus loved even saw the empty tomb, and we are not told that anyone took anything from it or ever returned to it after their initial visits. If the burial wrappings had borne a clear, miraculous image of Jesus' body, the disciples' skepticism in every gospel account would make very little sense. It would have been the first and most obvious piece of evidence they'd have pointed to. But there is absolutely no mention of it. Instead, we are told in the book of Acts and elsewhere in the New Testament that the disciples performed miraculous signs in order to authenticate their gospel message. No relic of Jesus himself is ever presented as evidence of the resurrection in the New Testament. If there had been such a relic, it's almost inconceivable to me that it would not have been mentioned. The second point that I'll offer for your consideration here is the fact that there is no mention of anything being special about Jesus' burial wrappings or his disciples having kept or exhibited them in any of the writings of the early church fathers, that is, the Ante-Nicene fathers, men like Justin, Irenaeus, Eusebius, Ignatius, Tertullian, or Origen. Nor is there any such mention in any of the writings of the later church fathers, including men like Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory. Many of these men were actively involved in apologetics, that is, the defense of the faith, engaging in discourse with non-believers. They crafted elaborate arguments and often speculated on topics that seem strange to us today. Clement of Rome, for instance, made reference to the legend of the phoenix, seeming to think that there might be some truth in it. Had the shroud existed, I cannot imagine that all of these men would remain silent on it, even if the church had somehow decided to hide the shroud in order to protect it, as someone once suggested to me. It would have been too important an artifact to conceal, and hiding it would have defeated the purpose of serving as evidence for the resurrection. There was some discussion of relics of the cross and items associated with Christian martyrs during the 3rd and 4th centuries, including efforts made by the Empress Helena to collect relics from the Holy Land, but there was no mention of a burial shroud during all that time. Alleged face cloths, such as the image of Edessa, began appearing in the 5th and 6th centuries, but there is no mention of a full body cloth until the 10th century in the letter of Constantine VII, which is dated to 958. But even then, no image is described on the cloth, and no details are given as to its dimensions. Some later writers claim that the image of Edessa might have been the Shroud of Turin folded in such a way that only the face was visible, but there is no historical or textual evidence to support that connection. In fact, the two traditions are centuries apart and may represent another example of legendary development. The first indisputable mentions of the shroud do not appear until sometime between the years 1353 and 1357, when it surfaced in the French village of Luray, where it was donated to the church by a nobleman named Geoffroy de Charnay. Bishop Pierre d'Arcis of Troyes investigated the shroud and wrote a letter to Pope Clement VII, declaring it to be a painted forgery. Pope Clement then allowed the shroud to be displayed as a representation, but not as the actual burial cloth of Christ. In summary, then, if there was anything special about the burial wrappings of Jesus, it was insufficient to convince his disciples of the reality of his resurrection, certainly not to the point where they decided to keep and display the wrappings. While not conclusive, the absence of any such mentions of the shroud in the New Testament writings, or for centuries afterwards in the writings of the Church Fathers, in spite of the Christian obsession with relics and apologetics, is strong evidence that the Shroud of Turin, however cleverly it may have been made, is exactly what the majority of experts have concluded that it is, a work of medieval art. The shroud may be fascinating, mysterious, even beautiful, but like so many supposed relics of the Middle Ages, it tells us more about the faith and artistry of the people who created it than about the first-century world of Jesus. Now, this has been a relatively quick and narrow look at a broad and complex issue. If you're interested in diving deeper into issues with the shroud, I encourage you to check out the following two videos, both by Dr. James Tabor, retired professor of New Testament at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The first is a 30-minute presentation detailing issues with the shroud. The second is a much more detailed 2-hour presentation in which Dr. Tabor goes into the same information but develops it to a much greater degree. Both videos are well worth your time if you have any interest in this subject at all. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Please consider subscribing to the channel. And until next time, thank you for watching.